Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Gameweek 21 wildcard draft, and I'm not going to be wildcard myself, but I recognize that some people might be in situations where they feel like their team needs a wildcard, and part of this too is because if you've been, let's say, using a lot of free transfers to build around, making a squad without Haaland, right now there is an opportunity to simply just go back into Haaland with the Gameweek 21 draft wildcard. Not to mention that if you, let's say, have invested into multiple players that are going to AFCON or the Asia Cup, let's say if you have more than just Salah and Son and you have players like Kudush or you have Hee-Chan as well, or for example, you're looking at your team and it's been decimated by injuries, etc., then of course it might make sense to do an early wild card. The only thing I would say with wild card 2 is, we know that there will be blanks and doubles this season once again. This is the reality. And you could be better served by holding off this wild card. So that's the sort of initial first point of advice that I would give. But let's go on quickly towards Gameweek 21 wildcard. Biggest thing too that I would say before we actually get started with the picks is that things can change very slightly, right? We know that there are FA Cup games and EFL Cup games before Gameweek 21's deadline will come. What I've done is created a wildcard draft that shouldn't really be impacted at all by those games. So I've sort of deliberately picked players that shouldn't be influenced, or we wouldn't have additional information on their teams before the Gameweek 21 wildcard draft deadline. And so, of course, if let's say things change, maybe you'd have to consider one or two things. For example, let's say if Liverpool don't have a blank in the future, but instead actually have a double game week, then of course it might make sense to actually have more Liverpool players within this draft. That's the only thing I'd really mention for now. In terms of most of the picks suggested in the video, I think that they're going to be, pretty much impervious to any sort of updates from the Cups, barring injuries, of course. Now, let's quickly go on towards the squad. Biggest thing here is, in terms of goalkeepers, just to start with, is whether you actually go towards a Man City keeper just because they have a probability of a double. Now, personally, I think it doesn't need to be done. I think that I'd rather probably go Walker over Ederson, if I'm honest, if I was to go for one City defender and to pick between the two of them. And I'd rather have Areola and Turner, just like people who did Game Week 8 wildcard drafts with Haaland and Salah. Areola and Turner is the cheapest sort of combination pair of goalkeepers in the game. And with Newcastle really looking so poor, there's no reason to really spend money on Dubravka. If anything, I think the best cheap goalkeeper in the game that isn't Areola right now is probably Pickford. And ultimately, you don't really necessarily need to do so if you just are happy with Areola and Turner. So those are the two goalkeepers. And then in terms of the defense, as I said, because we're not going for Ederson here, you do have an opportunity to go with simply Walker. And I like Walker a lot just because he's played 90 minutes for every game in the Premier League, and also Stones is still injured. I do know that Stones is coming back soon, but also we've seen multiple times this season that when Stones has played, that Walker has also played. So in the past, for example, in the sort of back half of last season, there were multiple games where Walker was benched. If you guys remember when Stones was sort of injected into the midfield and Man City were playing a certain style. Now this has seemingly changed. However, you might not want to, for example, be fixated on that, right? It's very possible that Pep can actually change his lineup, but I would also say that Walker's change in terms of his importance within the locker room and the squad seemingly has had an impact on his minutes this season. And the only thing, of course, is going to be when you go into, let's say, a more congested fixture period, does it become the case that Walker actually loses out minutes when the Champions League minutes are there as well? I probably would suggest no, because he's a very fit player, but of course he is able, and he has been in the past, able to succumb to injury. So that's the only question mark. As far as other picks here, I would go with definitely Gabriel and Estupiñán. Why I would go with Gabriel is simply because I think he's still the most nailed Arsenal player at the cheapest price, right? We think that Saliba's nailed. Absolutely, we do. Zinchenko and White are nailed, but Tomiyasu's already back. And so for me, the question mark is, we know with Kiwior as well being there that both Zinchenko and White can be rotated. And this is probably going to be an inevitability, really. And I would say Gabriel is someone who's played brilliantly, particularly in this sort of second half of the season. I think he's actually probably maybe even outshone William Saliba just a bit slightly. And personally, at that sort of price, considering he is cheaper than Saliba, I really think that it's hard to pass up on someone like Gabriel. As far as Estupiñán, very, very logical. He is back fit now. Now, the biggest thing, too, of course, is that his minutes will probably still be managed because he is coming back from an injury, and not to mention one injury, but just two injuries back to back, right? And I think as a part of sort of due diligence from Brighton, it does make sense that Estupiñán might lose out on a few minutes, but I really think that he's just going to become a better and better pick as long as he stays injury free. And so he is a bit of a no-brainer for me. He starts off with a perfect fixture on Gameweek 21. Estupiñán is a lovely pick. Now, the fourth defender here is going to be Alexander-Arnold. And a lot of people are going to be asking the question, what to do when Salah and Son come back. And I think that's totally fine. But given that you actually have a wild card and you're creating a deep squad, I think the idea here is to probably go with as many defenders as possible that cover different fixture opportunities. And so when, let's say, Salah and Son come back, whenever they do, you would be the most sort of flexible towards them. Because the biggest thing that I would say right now is that if you look at a lot of people who've been crafting teams recently, let's say you own, for example, someone like Porro and you need him to play Game Week 21, it's not a very good fixture for Porro, right? And so I do think potentially the time to, let's say, own Porro has technically come and gone, but you can still continue to own Porro. The biggest thing with Porro, I would say, is that his sort of efficacy as an FPL player does also depend specifically on whether Maddison is back in the team, because the biggest thing that has made Porro such a good asset is actually because Maddison sort of leaving the game has meant that Porro has had access to more corners and more free kicks. And usually, of course, if Maddison is back, which he would be back eventually within a few game weeks, you would know that Porro is going to be a slightly worse asset by that point in time. So I think it makes sense to actually go without Porro in the wildcard draft and instead go for someone like Pau here, who does play for this Aston Villa team and is absolutely nailed in this team so long as he is fit. Now, of course, Pau hasn't played a lot of minutes recently, but I do think that over the sort of January break, that's more than enough time for him to sort of find his way back into the starting first team. If you don't like an Aston Villa defender, you can definitely go with Pedro Porro instead. But I also think that you also need to think that your defense probably needs some options that you're happy to keep at the fourth or fifth option at the back of your bench. And you don't always need to have, 5 incredible players in defense. And so that's why Pau is suggested as an option. As far as the midfield here in this draft, we are going to be going with Saka, Bowen, Foden, Palmer, and Richarlison. Now, the one player that I think is actually a little bit of a question mark is both, or two players rather, are Foden and Bowen, right? I do think that out of one of the two players, the big risk, of course, is with Foden's minutes. And so your question should probably be, are there any alternatives to Foden? And personally, of course, I think there's two ways to go about this. You either go for a Crystal Palace midfielder like Olise or Eze, or you go for an Odegaard, right? Because this draft right now only features one Arsenal player. And personally, I think you can definitely step towards, only features two Arsenal players, and you can definitely step towards three Arsenal players. It also depends on whether you have the confidence that Arsenal's attack can, for example, continue to go back to ticking, right? Odegaard is a 90-minute player. He would not have the doubts that Foden does. Foden, for me, is still interesting. I'm not expecting for him to necessarily be someone who's going to be playing 90 minutes from here on out. But the biggest thing, of course, is that Man City have a probable chance of double gaming 25. And also, with KDB's fitness in doubt, and also Foden being able to play flexibly more positions than, for example, like Alvarez, once Haaland and KDB come back into this team, the biggest thing that I see is that Foden will probably actually enjoy some minutes where he will play maybe a little bit deeper in the field, or maybe KDB plays a bit deeper, right? Reminded that actually at the sort of first game of the season, we actually still saw, for example, a team that featured Alvarez, Foden, KDB, and Haaland. So it's very possible that all of these players can coexist together, but that, of course, for example, takes away one of the winger spots because Grealish was injured in Game Week 1. So I think, for me, I do feel that Alvarez will probably lose the minutes the most, but Foden is someone that I think also, in terms of just recent form, has deserved, to stay within this team. And I genuinely would struggle to believe that Pep would completely isolate him from the team. So I think Foden is still a very good punt. And Bowen is for me, is still the option that I would prefer over Odegaard. But if you actually don't like Bowen, for example, and you're, let's say, worried about Paqueta and his injury status, plus also Kudus leaving towards AFCON, then I think it does make sense to actually drop Bowen and go for Odegaard instead. He's also going to be a slightly better differential. His underlying stats are very different when you compare to a player with a profile of Bowen. Bowen is more someone who is goal dominant, less creative, definitely a centre forward right now, whereas Odegaard, of course, you are looking at a centre midfielder who has access to set pieces, probably more access to bonus points, and is going to be a bit more creative, right, whilst also losing a little bit in terms of the expected goal share. However, he can also have a chance of being on penalties. That's the big thing. I do think Saka is absolutely nailed. I think Palmer is absolutely nailed as well. I would not go for any sort of wild card without those two players. And then the last pick is going to be Richarlison. A lot of people are going to be questioning Richarlison because I think when you watch Richarlison week on week, he does miss a lot of opportunities. But the reality, I think, is that his minutes look good in the context that Son is now out for a while, and also Maddison continues to be out. Lo Celso, of course, is sort of now replacing Maddison as that sort of deep lying player for the team. arguably, of course, the 10 at times, depending on how you sort of interpret his role in the system. But the reality, too, is that Spurs right now need a centre forward, and Veliz, I think, also succumbed to an injury, a small injury at least, within that previous game versus Bournemouth. So I think Richarlison right now, this is the best time to own Richarlison because he's probably going to have access to penalties. I can't see anyone else taking penalties over him, particularly that Maddison is out. And so Richarlison, for me, is just a no-brainer pick. Now, of course, you can say that the team will continue to drop off in terms of the attacking quality with Son out, but let's look at this team that a lot of people said were doomed when Maddison was out of the team. I think ultimately Lo Celso has really improved things, but Son, of course, has played brilliantly. Biggest thing, of course, is going to be whether someone like Kulusevski or Bryan Hill can, for example, provide a little bit more of the sort of quality as a creative player on the wing positions. And I think it's possible, particularly since Bentancur is now back, and that sort of allows Kulusevski to shift towards a winger role. And so I think Richarlison is a bit of a no-brainer. He's just at a ridiculous price point where I would still definitely consider him on a Gameweek 21 wildcard. He's going to be more of a punt, right? And as soon as Maddison comes back, you can definitely then think about moving Richarlison out of your team, but he's more than going to serve you for at least 4 game weeks, in my opinion. As far as the front line, because we've actually spent so much money in the midfield, I think it makes sense to actually have a cheaper front line. And the only player that is, going to be omitted here is Watkins. I think it really just depends on whether your team budget can have access to Watkins. If you can have access to Watkins, then fair enough. Go for Watkins over João Pedro, although I think that's a huge difference in price. Personally, I think I would go with Haaland, Solanke, and João Pedro. The reason why I say this is because Solanke is going to have a pretty high chance of having a double game week in the short term, just because if you think about where and when the fixture versus Luton will sort of be replayed, ultimately it should be during this period between game week 23 to around game week 28, and that's going to really boost Solanke and his sort of efficacy as well, right? You almost have a decent chance of a double, and also you're looking at a player who, in my opinion, is basically budget Watkins, because he's actually, in some ways, better too. He's got penalties, he's got really similar underlying stats, he's less creative than Watkins, of course, that's the one big difference, I would say, but he is someone who absolutely gets a lot of expected goal share as well, and this Bournemouth team, as we've seen recently, have looked incredible, and even, for example, in the Spurs game where they lost, I don't think they were even necessarily the second best side. In fact, I think they actually missed a couple of key opportunities. You could say the same thing for Spurs as well. But you can see that Bournemouth are capable of sort of posting up really good numbers versus great teams. Even when the Newcastle team wasn't completely horrific, they had gotten a great result versus them too. Haaland is a bit of a no-brainer. Now, of course, there's going to be an asterisk on Haaland because we don't necessarily know how fully fit he is. But considering that we actually have so much budget available, we don't have Salah and Son in the team, it just makes sense to wildcard pretty much no matter what with Haaland in your team, unless, of course, he succumbs to some sort of long-term injury, right? The reality, of course, is he might not play a lot of minutes versus Newcastle, but you can continue to own Haaland for the short term. This is a game week where you'd probably bench Solanke as well, so you can actually play someone like João Pedro and Haaland. Or, for example, if Haaland doesn't seem like he's going to play a lot of minutes versus Newcastle, you ultimately just bench him for 1 week. And so this is going to be the Game Week 21 draft wildcard. And those are my thoughts in terms of players. As I said, I think the roles where you can change quite a bit is that position where Pau sits, right, as the 5th defender within your team. He can be someone like Pedro Porro if you have extra budget and you want to spend towards getting Pedro Porro. But keep in mind, of course, that Pedro Porro will probably decline as, a high-quality asset when Maddison comes back. In terms of the midfield, do consider Odegaard as well if you want to consider Odegaard. I do think Foden is a bit of a risk. If you don't really want to take the risk of Foden, then clearly you can actually go for Odegaard as well. If you can't afford Odegaard, though, I do think it also makes sense to just simply consider someone between Olise and Eze. I personally think that Olise is going to be on penalties, so I would go with Olise, but if you prefer and you think Eze is going to be on penalties, go with Eze. As far as the forward line, once again, it's a case of budget. Personally, I think João Pedro, this is the best position and best situation he's really had all season. You have De Zerbi absolutely glossing over him. He's playing 90 minutes a game. He can play left wing or he can play in the striker position. And you have multiple players out injured for Brighton, and he seems to be absolutely essential whilst also retaining penalties. So this is the wildcard draft. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care and goodbye, and thank you to all the members of the channel for supporting me. See you guys next week.